This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Everywhere there are lighting poles, there's one more opportunity to save money. Intelligent Illuminations provides cost-effective wireless lighting solutions for roadway or area outdoor lights. Kanawha Valley Arena, Virginia's cowboy town, hosting an array of events from Civil War reenactments to diesel truck pulls. More information online at virginiarodeo.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. So what do you do? Information about getting involved in advanced technology careers, making everything from clean energy to life-saving medicine, is available at dreamitdoitvirginia.com. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and again, thanks to the Sorensen Leadership Class 2013 for helping to provide some of the questions that we're asking statewide candidates, and a very special welcome to Senator Mark Herring, who's in the middle of a Senate term, but you're not running for the Senate. You're running for Attorney General. You've been in the Senate since 2006, served on some important committees, Commerce and Labor, General Laws, Rehab and Social Services, and now it's the race for Attorney General. So why don't you start just telling our viewers something about yourself and about why are you running for Attorney General?
Well, sure. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on the show. I'm delighted to be here. I grew up in Loudoun County, and my first job out of high school was working construction as a laborer. And thanks to some jobs in construction and restaurants and some Pell Grants and student loans, I worked my way through college at UVA, and a few years later I went to law school and earned my law degree from the University of Richmond. And at that point I had a lot of great opportunities open up. But the best one for me was to go back to my hometown of Leesburg, where I had been raised, and to establish my law practice there, raise my own family there, and that was 23 years ago. I've had a general civil law practice that entire time, been a town attorney, county supervisor, got my start in politics as a county supervisor in Loudoun, and was elected to the Senate in 2006 and reelected again in 2007 and 11. And since being in the Senate, a lot of the issues I've been working on are things that were real important to the constituents I represented and all Virginians really: transportation, education, healthcare, economic development, and public safety. And I started looking at running for Attorney General because I saw what our current one was doing. And there's been way too much politics in the Attorney General's office under Ken Cuccinelli. And time again, we have seen how he has bent and twisted the law in order to try to impose policies on Virginians that were way outside the mainstream. And I think that's wrong. I'm running to take that kind of politics out of the office and put the law first.
I was looking in the Constitution to see what does it say about the Attorney General, and I found this sentence: "He shall perform such duties and receive such compensation as may be presided by law." So then I decided to look at the code. Mm-hmm. I'm not a lawyer, you know that, so I was trying to find out what's the Attorney General supposed to do, and it says almost the same. It says, "Be the Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Law and perform such duties as may be provided by law." Over 500 documents with over 1,000 references to the Attorney General. But from your perspective, the current Attorney General has been too
too ideological, in my view. And you asked a little bit about what the Attorney General does and what's the job of the Attorney General. The Attorney General is the state's chief legal officer, oversees the state's legal department, and is supposed to provide objective legal advice to the governor and his administration and to all of the boards, agencies, commissions, universities, departments of the state, and serve as consumer counsel in rate cases in front of the State Corporation Commission. But aside from those specific duties, and the Attorney General has a storied past. It was originally a position that was created in the courts of medieval England. And the king thought, hey, it's a good idea to have a lawyer to protect his money and property. But what happened was, over time, as that job began to be really one to protect and defend the interests of the king, something really fascinating happened with the job. When the United States was established after the Revolution, the job of Attorney General changed. And instead of defending and protecting the interests of the king, it was defending and protecting the interests of the public. And the Attorney General is really the guardian of the public interest in that sense. So part of the job is providing that objective advice to the state agencies and departments and so forth. But it's also looking at what are the problems out in the state. Can the law be used to help address those problems? And if so, what resources within the state's legal department can we bring to bear to help people? And that's really what the job of the Attorney General is all about, being the guardian of the public interest.
So when you drill down a bit, then when the Attorney General has staff members that are advising state agencies or state boards, then the primary responsibility for them is protecting the public interest, would you say, rather than protecting the interest of that board, whether it's the Board of Visitors at UVA or any particular board?
Well, the way I would see it is that the public's interest is in making sure that those who are charged with making decisions have the benefit of good, objective legal advice and good counsel. And that's really, politics can creep into it sometimes, and I think that's wrong. And I'll cite a couple of examples. Early in Ken Cuccinelli's term, one of the things he did was to sue UVA because he disagreed with the research that a scientist there, Michael Mann, was doing about the connection between pollution and the environment. And that's wrong. That is an abuse of the powers of the office. And it was done for political reasons. And that kind of using the power of the state to go after and persecute someone for their ideas is downright un-American. That's wrong. And so that's the kind of politics that I want to take out of the office and put the law first.
Let's go to one of the issues that's really gotten a great deal of attention, and that is matters pertaining to ethics or disclosures. As current state senator and as candidate for Attorney General, what's your perspective on what should occur with regards to any changes in Virginia's law?
Mm-hmm. Well, first let me say, like all Virginians, I'm deeply disturbed by the revelations that we've seen over the last 5-6 months involving Governor McDonnell, Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, and Star Scientific. Public officials should not be using their office for personal gain and benefit. That's wrong. When the first stories broke about back in late spring, when we heard about a $15,000 gift to the governor or his family for a wedding, I thought that was wrong. And the Attorney General ought to be in a position to investigate that. Turned out our Attorney General himself was all tied up in it as well. So I wrote to the Justice Department, to the Public Integrity Section, saying we need an independent investigation of what happened. Virginians deserve to get the facts and get to the bottom of it and know whether public policy was influenced, whether any laws were broken. And since then, it just seems to have been an avalanche of additional revelations that is just deeply disturbing. And it's been a tarnish on Virginia's reputation. So what I would do is, first of all, we need major ethics reform. I think Virginians have relied upon a sort of a lax system of disclosure, coupled with the belief that the people they were electing were honest and had integrity, and in some cases we've seen that's not enough, and we need to toughen up our laws. So what I would do, and I have proposed a 5-point plan to restore integrity in state government. First of all, we need an independent ethics commission, and this commission can make sure that our ethics laws are enforced and administered, and so when there are allegations like this, they're investigated. We need a gift ban, an outright gift ban, and that needs to be extended to family members of the elected officials. Number 3, we need to put some teeth into the penalties for violations of these ethics laws. 4th, we need to change the rules that allow campaigns and committees to pay personal expenses of candidates and their family members. That needs to be changed. And 5th, I think we need more transparency in government, and that would include the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General seems to think there is some blanket exception that the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply, and that's wrong. And we need to take needed action, and the ethics rules should be something that is right in the wheelhouse of the Attorney General. And when I'm Attorney General, I'm going to make that one of my top priorities.
On the Independent Ethics Commission, if my research is correct, even back in the Wilder administration, that was mentioned, discussed in some study that was being conducted. Have you, I know you're busy campaigning, but have you had time to talk to some of your colleagues? Do you think that, is there the stomach for having an independent ethics commission?
Well, there needs to be. And, a couple of years ago, we had the issue with Phil Hamilton, who was convicted a couple of years ago. The Center for Public Integrity had done a nationwide survey and found that Virginia's public integrity laws were among the weakest in the country, and that we were ripe for some type of corruption scandal. And then we've seen what's happened with the governor and the Attorney General and Star Scientific. And not just Star Scientific involving the Attorney General. Now there's a question about his involvement and the office's involvement weighing in on the side of an out-of-state energy company against Virginians who are just trying to get what they're entitled to in court. So there are all these ethics issues now. I think there's definitely the momentum to get this done, and it's something that Virginians need to make sure that their legislators accomplish. Now, if for any reason the legislature fails to act, I've made it very clear that as Attorney General, me and all of my staff and my family will comply with those types of ethics rules and disclosures, because the Attorney General of all of the offices needs to set the very highest ethical standards, and I will.
Let's talk some about transportation. You mentioned it as one of the big issues. Do you see it as somewhat settled after what you all did during the session? It was a controversy, and you and the Senate, the House were right in the midst of all that, trying to work it out. But so reflect, if you will, for our viewers, some back on what you all accomplished, and then looking forward, do you see more work to be done?
Yeah. Well, let me say transportation is a hugely important issue for all Virginians and for the business community around the state, and has been for a number of years, and has a lot to do with what voters elected me to do in Richmond when they first elected me back in that special election in 2006. And we've been working hard on it since. And I will give Governor McDonnell a great deal of credit. He came forward with a transportation proposal, and an interesting thing happened. Democrats and Republicans in the General Assembly started working together. And it was really nice to see, after several years of inaction and inability to get something done, legislators came together from both sides of the aisle, both chambers, working with the governor, and we were able to make reasonable compromises. Not everything in there is what I can say I agree with everything in there. There are things I disagree with, sure. Probably everybody could point to something in it they disagree with. But I think, in addition to just what it will do for transportation in Virginia, will be huge, but it's also representative of a different approach to governing. And I, together with my colleagues, many of my colleagues in the General Assembly, looked for common ground, worked to try to find a solution, and we got something passed. Now, my opponent in this race, Senator Obenshain, did not. He kept those ideological blinders on and voted against the bill and against progress. And what that shows is not only was his vote against Transportation one that will hurt Virginians and make it harder to get some of these transportation problems fixed, but it also shows what happens when that kind of Tea Party intransigent officials set in, and we need to get things done. It's almost like Congress not getting anything done for those ideological reasons. We need to bring a problem-solving, a responsible and pragmatic approach to governing. That's the way I've been in the Senate. That's the kind of Attorney General I'm going to be.
Let's go to another issue, Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. Again, debated a great deal. No final resolution made during the 2013 session. The commission that's looking at what particular waivers might be requested, federal government. Where do you stand on the issue of Medicaid expansion?
I support Medicaid expansion. It's the right thing to do. It will provide health care for hundreds of thousands of Virginians that currently do not have health care. So it's the right thing to do for the people in the state, and it will provide billions of dollars back into the Virginia economy at a time when we really need it. It's estimated that it will help create 30,000 new health care jobs. And so I think it is critically important for us to do that, to just send that money back to the federal government, the billions of dollars each year, would be a huge mistake for us. And at the same time, move forward with Medicaid reform. It can't be just about putting more money into it. We also need to look at ways to make it more efficient and make sure it's working smoothly. And the Medicaid reforms that are being requested, I think, are achievable. I think the government will allow that, and it'll be good for the people of Virginia, it'll be good for hospitals, it'll be good for the state as a whole. And the Attorney General will have a lot to do with Medicaid expansion as well as the new health insurance exchange, because I'd mentioned earlier about how the Attorney General's office will provide legal counsel and guidance to all of the agencies. That includes the Department of Medical Assistance Services and the Health Department, and working with the State Corporation Commission to make sure that the health insurance exchange, when it's set up, that the rules are clear and simple, and that when problems come up, we take that problem-solving approach to fix it and make it work for all Virginians.
You know, another issue that has just appeared on the horizon, and we'll tell our viewers that we're having a conversation on September 4th. I had the opportunity to tape a program with the other Mark Obenshain, September 3rd, so we didn't discuss this issue. But today on the front page of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, our current Attorney General says an act that was passed and signed into law by the governor, he now deems unconstitutional and will not defend if there's a suit. So apart from the issue, because I think in the Senate it was a party line vote, and the Democrats were against advancing this statewide school board approach. Republicans supported it. But seeing yourself in the role of Attorney General, and the General Assembly and the governor have signed something into law, how do you perceive the role of the Attorney General at that point in time?
That is a really good question. Let me just start off with the policy itself. I oppose the state school takeover law as a matter of policy and as a matter of constitutional law. As a matter of policy, I thought it was wrong because I thought it would be better for the students in those schools to try to bring in proven strategies from around the country that have been shown to be effective to improve student achievement at schools that were underperforming, and that would be the better approach to take rather than have that seen as some kind of opportunity for the state to come in and create some private charters and things like that. So I thought as a matter of policy, it was wrong. I also concluded that it conflicted with the state constitution, which requires that local schools be operated by local elected or local school boards. So I was opposed to the legislation, but you asked the question a little more generally about, when should an attorney general not represent, not accept a case? And that is a really important question. So let me talk about that a little bit. There are times when an attorney general will be called upon to defend a state law that the Attorney General may not agree with as a matter of policy. But my feeling is if the law was validly passed and it's constitutional, that's the will of the people, and that means you should give that law effect as passed by the legislature. But there are times when an Attorney General shouldn't take a case, for example, if there's a conflict of interest. And I think I've talked a little bit about Star
Right.
Scientific, and
Right.
the Attorney General owned stock in this company and was handling a case on behalf of the state against it. That's wrong, and special counsel can be brought in to represent cases in that situation. Same if the expertise that's needed in the Attorney General's office isn't there, you can bring in special counsel. But I also think if a law is unconstitutional, the Attorney General should not be defending an unconstitutional law. And the way I would go about making that determination, and it's a very important judgment for an Attorney General to make, is to bring in the experts in the Attorney General's office who have the knowledge of that particular subject matter, review the key United States and Virginia Supreme Court opinions and the precedent, the legal analysis, and very deliberately and thoughtfully draw a conclusion about whether the law was constitutional. If it is, then the Attorney General should defend that. But if it's not, the Attorney General needs to give primacy to that foundational law, which is the Constitution, and that takes precedence over a law passed by the General Assembly. Now, and that also gets to a difference, and you said you didn't get a chance to talk to my opponent, Senator Obenshain, about that, but I've heard him on the campaign trail say it's the duty of the Attorney General to defend the laws of the General Assembly no matter what, and I would suggest that it's important for him maybe to dust off his constitutional law notes from law school and take a look at that. The Constitution is primary and foundational law.
Not that often, but there are occasions when the Attorney General, this one or others, would advise the General Assembly and the governor when you're considering an act. That occurred even in the 2013 session with regards to transportation. And then some changes were made. So certainly there's some eyebrows being raised already about the timing of this and whether or not there should have been some counsel to the governor and the General Assembly before it was signed into law.
Well, I can't, I'm not privy to what the Attorney General had in mind as far as timing and that sort of thing goes, but I can tell you that as Attorney General, that will be one of the things that I will do, is to make sure that as legislation is being considered by the General Assembly, that the staff in the Attorney General's office reviews those bills, and if there are constitutional questions, to raise them at the time the legislature is considering them. And there were questions being raised about this particular law at the time, and as I said, I voted against it for a couple of reasons, one on policy grounds, but the other on constitutional grounds.
As you think about the Attorney Generals that have served in recent years, I would say in your lifetime, but more in your time even since law school, do some come to mind that certain aspects of how they manage that Department of Law that you would want to have as a part of your way of doing it if you serve as Attorney General?
Well, I've had a great opportunity to speak with a number of different attorneys general over the years. We've had some very good ones, and I think Governor Belials was able to really do a lot in his term as Attorney General in terms of the professionalism of the office, and that really points to one of the things that I would like to make sure that I accomplish as Attorney General. It's taking the politics out of the law, out of the office, and putting the law first, and make sure that the staff in the office is really pursuing the work on behalf of the public, and doing it in a way that reflects that philosophy, that guiding philosophy that we have to the public, to provide that good, objective legal advice as the state's legal department.
Senator Herring, we very much appreciate your being on This Week in Richmond. Wish we had more time, but appreciate it, and look forward to having more conversation with you. And we just would encourage people to be mindful of issues, to look at your website, and we'll make sure it's up so that people can see it, and to be sure they're voting on November 5th.
Well, thank you very much. There's a lot at stake in the upcoming elections. I'm convinced it's one of the most important Attorney General's races in a generation or more in Virginia. I feel like I've got the right experience and know-how to return the office to providing the good, objective legal advice and make it the legal department that it should be on behalf of the people and be the people's lawyer.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Everywhere there are lighting poles, there's one more opportunity to save money. Intelligent Illuminations provides cost-effective wireless lighting solutions for roadway or area outdoor lights. Kanawha Valley Arena, Virginia's cowboy town, hosting an array of events from Civil War reenactments to diesel truck pulls. More information online at virginiarodeo.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. So what do you do? Information about getting involved in advanced technology careers, making everything from clean energy to life-saving medicine, is available at dreamitdoitvirginia.com. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.